Sometime in October 2025, a dredging vessel positioned itself over a submerged reef in the South China Sea and turned on its pumps. The reef had a name, Antelope Reef. It sat in the Parasil Islands, fully submerged at high tide, claimed by China and Vietnam and Taiwan simultaneously. The subject of competing legal filings and diplomatic protests and zero physical consequence for any of those filings or protests. It was, by the letter of international law, a rock. Not an island, a rock. And under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the foundational legal framework governing who owns what in the world's oceans, a rock generates 12 nautical miles of territorial water. An island generates 200. The dredger began pumping sand from the seabed onto the reef. By December, satellite images showed a sandbar emerging from the water. By March 2026, what had been a submerged rock had become 6 million square meters of land. This land was larger than most of the world's airports. Construction equipment was visible. The outline of a runway was forming. Antelope Reef was becoming an island. Not a natural one. A manufactured one. The world, according to Forbes magazine, largely stayed silent for 5 months before Vietnam's first official protest was filed. The prosecution opens with the single image, a dredger, a pump, and a country that decided the geography it was given by geology is insufficient. The prosecution opens with a country that has decided the geography it was given by geology is insufficient and has begun building its own. The charge before this court is not about sand and dredging ships. The charge is about a strategy, a systematic, decades-long, legally precise, and militarily sophisticated plan to solve through manufactured geography the fundamental geopolitical problem that China's natural geography has always created. To understand the strategy, you must first understand the problem. China is the world's second largest economy and its largest trading nation. It moves approximately $15 trillion of goods per year. 90% of that trade moves by sea. And virtually all of that sea trade, the oil from the Middle East, the raw materials from Africa, the manufactured goods to Europe and the Americas, travels through two narrow passages. The two narrow passages are the Strait of Malacca and the South China Sea. The South China Sea is not simply a body of water adjacent to China's coast. It is the world's second busiest shipping lane. Roughly $5 trillion of trade passes through the South China Sea annually. More than half of the world's merchant fleet tonnage transits it each year. Every barrel of oil heading to China from the Persian Gulf, every container ship leaving a Chinese port for Europe, every LNG tanker supplying China's growing gas appetite, all moves through the sea. Here is the problem that has kept Chinese strategic planners awake since at least 2003, when President Hu Jintao gave a classified speech in which he named it directly. In a conflict, the United States Navy could blockade the Strait of Malacca, operating from bases in Japan, the Philippines, Guam, Diego Garcia, and its alliance with Singapore. The United States Navy could sever 80% of China's oil supply without a single shot being fired at Chinese soil. Who called it the Malacca Dilemma? China's 2015 National Military Strategy, a public document, which is remarkable in its candor, stated that protecting sea lanes and maritime rights had become an imminent issue. China's 2015 military strategy stated that the traditional mentality that land outweighs sea must be abandoned. The traditional mentality was being abandoned. The islands were the proof. The prosecution now presents Exhibit A, the map. In 1947, a cartographer working for the nationalist Chinese government drew a map. His name was Yang Huairan. On that map, he placed 11 dashes in the South China Sea, forming a rough U shape that enclosed roughly 90% of the sea within what the Chinese government claimed as its historical waters. The line ran as far as 2,000 kilometers from the Chinese mainland to within a few hundred kilometers of the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Brunei. The legal basis for this claim was historical usage. Historical usage is a category that does not exist in UNCLOS. When the Philippines challenged China before the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, the court ruled in 2016 that this category had no lawful effect. The 9-dash line, the court declared, was not a legal maritime boundary. The Spratly Islands, the chain of reefs and shoals at the center of the dispute, were legally rocks, not islands. Rocks generate territorial seas of 12 nautical miles, not exclusive economic zones of 200. China rejected the ruling immediately. Xi Jinping called it null and void. China has not complied with a single provision of it. And then China began building. Here is what the prosecution needs the court to understand about the relationship between those two events, the court ruling in the building program. Because the standard analysis misses the precise legal logic being exploited. Enclosed defines an island as a naturally formed area of land surrounded by water, which is above water at high tide. Rocks, features that cannot sustain human habitation or economic life of their own, get 12 miles. Islands get 200. The distinction is between geology and law. Between what the ocean floor accidentally produced and what a country is entitled to claim. China's position, which it has never formally abandoned despite the 2016 ruling, is that if you build a structure on a rock that can sustain human habitation, if you install fresh water, food, power generation, military barracks, a runway, and permanently station people on it, then that rock has become, in practical if not legal terms, an island. An island anchored in the middle of a sea generates 200 miles of legal jurisdiction in every direction. 200 nautical miles. In a sea that is at its widest approximately 650 nautical miles across. The arithmetic of this is devastating. 3 artificial islands with 200-mile exclusive economic zones in the center of the South China Sea would overlap to cover a majority of its surface area. This is not what the court ruled. It is not what international law permits. But it is what China is constructing, not as a legal argument, but as a physical fact. Physical facts, in geopolitics, have a way of outlasting legal rulings. The prosecution now presents Exhibits B, C, and D, Fiery Cross Reef, Mischief Reef, and Subi Reef. These 3 features were submerged or barely above water as recently as 2013. By 2016, China had added over 3,200 acres of land to its 7 occupied features in the Spratly Islands. Fiery Cross Reef now has a runway 3,125 meters long, capable of landing any aircraft in China's military inventory, including nuclear-capable H-6 bombers. It has a deep-water harbor. It has surface-to-air missile batteries. It has anti-ship cruise missile emplacements. It has more than 72 fighter jet hangars across the 3 major bases. The Asian Maritime Transparency Initiative, the Washington think tank that tracks construction via satellite imagery, has documented radar systems, electronic warfare jamming equipment, and hardened weapons shelters capable of surviving a strike from Fiery Cross Reef's runway. Chinese combat aircraft can patrol the entire South China Sea without refueling. They can reach the Malacca Strait approach in approximately 90 minutes of flight time, from nothing to a fully operational forward military base, on land that did not exist, in a location that no natural process put there in less than 4 years. This is not island building. This is the construction of an unsinkable aircraft carrier, placed deliberately, strategically, in the geographic center of the world's busiest shipping corridor. And in October 2025, after nearly a decade of relative pause, the dredgers returned. This time to Antelope Reef in the Paracel Islands, closer to Vietnam's coastline than any previous construction. Antelope Reef was positioned to extend Chinese air and naval coverage into the northern South China Sea. By April 2026, the Center for Strategic and International Studies estimated the reclaimed area had already matched Mischief Reef. A 9,000-foot runway was structurally possible given the dimensions of the emerging landmass. The construction is not paused. It is accelerating. Here is the myth the prosecution must dismantle, that this is a territorial dispute. The dominant framing in Western media since 2013 has positioned China's island building as an aggressive territorial claim. This framing is factually accurate but strategically incomplete. It explains the what but not the why, and by focusing on the territorial dimension, it consistently underestimates what is actually being built. Territory, in the modern era, is primarily valuable for what it generates legally. A piece of land generates a territorial sea and an exclusive economic zone. That's the legal framework. China wants the legal framework because the legal framework gives it the right to exclude other nations' military and commercial vessels from the exclusive economic zone, or at least to contest their presence. It wants to transform a region of open international waters into what it functionally treats as a Chinese domestic lake. But the deeper strategic purpose is not the exclusive economic zone. The exclusive economic zone is the legal cover. The actual strategic purpose is what military analysts call A2, AT anti-access, area denial. The islands are not meant to claim oil and fishing rights, though they do that too. They are meant to deny the United States Navy the ability to freely operate in the South China Sea in a conflict scenario. Specifically, a conflict over Taiwan. Think through the military geometry of this. In 2001, when the United States responded to the 9/11 attacks, and in 2003 when it invaded Iraq, it deployed multiple carrier strike groups through the South China Sea without a single obstacle. No Chinese military asset could challenge a U.S. carrier in that region. The sea was open. American power projected freely. Today, a U.S. carrier strike group attempting to transit the South China Sea in a conflict over Taiwan would be operating within range of land-based anti-ship missiles. These missiles are stationed on Fiery Cross, Mischief, and Subi reefs. It would be within range of surface-to-air missile batteries on multiple platforms. It would be under surveillance from radar systems on every major feature. Chinese submarines operating from the hardened pens of the artificial island harbors can sortie into the South China Sea without transiting the first island chain that U.S. intelligence assets monitor. The islands are not defensive positions, they are weapons platforms placed in water. Manufactured from sand, and they have fundamentally changed the military geography of the most contested sea on Earth. Admiral Harry Harris, then commander of U.S. Pacific Command, said in 2016 that China had built a Great Wall of Sand. The phrase was catchy but slightly wrong. A wall is defensive. What China built is offensive, a series of forward operating bases that compress the geography of the South China Sea into a zone where Chinese military power can be projected from a permanent and sinkable platform. The prosecution now reaches the legal architecture underlying all of this, because the island construction is only one half of the strategy. The other half is a legal theory so audacious, so precisely calibrated, that it deserves its own section in this indictment. China has never formally abandoned its 9-line claim. It has not complied with the 2016 Hague ruling. But it has also not formally reaffirmed the 9-line in a way that invites a direct legal confrontation. Instead, it has pursued a strategy that legal scholars have called lawfare, the systematic exploitation of ambiguity in international law to create facts on the ground, or in this case, in the water, that precede and eventually supplant legal rulings. Here is the specific ambiguity being exploited. Enclosed Article 121.3 says that rocks, features that cannot sustain human habitation or economic life of their own, do not generate exclusive economic zones. The 2016 tribunal ruled that all spratly features are rocks in their natural state. But Enclosed Article 60 says that a coastal state has the right to construct artificial islands and installations in its exclusive economic zone. The catch is that artificial islands do not generate their own exclusive economic zone. They are explicitly excluded from doing so. China's legal theory, which it pursues through action rather than articulation, goes like this. It claims a pre-existing exclusive economic zone from the 9-line. Within that claimed exclusive economic zone, it constructs artificial islands under Article 60. Those artificial islands, now equipped with airstrips in barracks in permanent populations, look and function like natural islands, even though the 2016 ruling says they are not, legally. And over time, through continuous occupation, through the establishment of administrative districts, through the issuing of fishing licenses, and the enforcement of regulations, China builds a practical jurisdiction over this water that increasingly functions like legal sovereignty. This happens regardless of what any tribunal has ruled. The world's courts can rule. China's dredgers can pour. And so far, the dredgers are winning. The third and final dimension of this strategy is the one most rarely discussed. Because the island building is not only about the South China Sea. Understand what it means for China to place an unsinkable aircraft carrier, a fully militarized artificial island with radar and missiles, and jet hangars, at the entrance to the Strait of Malacca's South China Sea approach. The Malacca Dilemma, as Hu Jintao named it, was this. In a conflict, the United States could blockade the strait and starve China of oil. The Belt and Road Initiative was one attempt to solve this problem. Build overland pipelines so that oil could reach China without passing through Malacca. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor through the Himalayas to Gwadar Port on the Arabian Sea was another. The islands are the third attempt, and the most direct. If China controls, through military presence on its artificial islands, the approach waters to the Strait of Malacca from the South China Sea side, then any American attempt to enforce a Malacca blockade requires first defeating or bypassing Chinese military assets positioned in the international waters through which the blockading fleet would have to pass. The islands do not solve the Malacca Dilemma. Nothing can fully solve it as long as Malacca itself is flanked by American allied nations. But the islands impose a cost. a military, logistical, and diplomatic cost. They impose a cost on any attempt to exploit it. They make the blockade harder. They make the cost of challenging China's maritime position higher. They are the geography of deterrence, manufactured from sand and strategic calculation, placed exactly where the mathematics of naval confrontation required them to be. This is not accidental. It is not opportunistic. China's 2015 military strategy stated it explicitly. The islands are where they are because the geography of the South China Sea, which China's natural coastline does not provide, demanded that someone put something there. And China decided that someone would be China. What remains in 2026 is a sea that has changed more dramatically in the past decade than any comparable body of water since the Suez Canal was constructed in 1869. China now controls 20 outposts in the Paracel Islands and 7 in the Spratlys, of which 4 have been converted into fully operational naval and air bases with runways, harbors, hardened weapons storage, and permanent military garrisons. Antelope Reef, where dredging began in October 2025, is set to become China's largest feature in the Paracels and potentially in the entire South China Sea. With a projected footprint capable of hosting a 9,000-foot runway, the world, as Forbes documented, largely failed to protest for 5 months after construction began. Vietnam protest, the Philippines protest. The United States conducts freedom of navigation operations. The United States sails warships through waters China claims, specifically to demonstrate that American law does not recognize the claim. China protests the operations. The ships pass, the islands do not move. The Philippines under President Marcos Jr. has taken a harder line than his predecessor, allowing the United States to access for additional Philippine military bases under the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. The Philippines has established a resupply mission to the BRP Sierra Madre, a deliberately grounded warship at 2nd Thomas Shoal that functions as a Philippine military outpost that has been repeatedly blocked and harassed by Chinese Coast Guard vessels using water cannons. In early 2025, the U.S. and Philippines conducted their largest ever joint military exercises, 12,000 troops, direct simulation of island defense scenarios. China conducted simultaneous live-fire exercises in the Taiwan Strait. The geography that did not exist in 2013 is now the central stage of the most significant military standoff in the Indo-Pacific. Here is what the prosecution rests on. China was given, by geography, a coastline along 1-14,500 kilometers, but one that faces a sea hemmed in by island chains it does not control. Japan and its islands form the first island chain to the east. The Philippines form the southeastern boundary. Taiwan sits in the center like a cork in a bottle, blocking the Pacific Ocean from China's eastern coast. The geography that China's natural terrain provided was, in military terms, a coastal defense position, not a blue water naval powers launch pad. The United States, by contrast, has Pacific Island bases at Guam and Wake Island. The United States has alliance bases in Japan and South Korea, and treaty relationships with the Philippines. The geography of American military power in the Pacific was built over a century of deliberate base acquisition, treaty construction, and strategic positioning. China's island building is not a departure from the rules. It is the application of the same strategic logic. Geography is military power. Using 21st century technology to manufacture what 19th century empire building would have taken by force. The dredger is the instrument. The sand is the raw material. The resulting island is the military base that the natural ocean floor did not provide. This is what is being built in the South China Sea. Not fishing platforms. Not research stations. Not the historical markers of a civilization that fished these waters for centuries. A new coastline. A new geography. Built by a country that looked at the map it was given and decided that map was not enough. The question that closes this prosecution, the question that no ruling, no protest, no freedom of navigation operation has answered. This is the question that determines what the South China Sea will look like in 2040. China's islands are built. The runways exist. The missile batteries are in place. The renewed construction at Antelope Reef signals a willingness to reshape maritime geography as a means of consolidating control, and it began after a decade of relative pause. In 2025, precisely when the Taiwan question was becoming more urgent, the window for establishing facts before any confrontation narrowed. The 2016 Hague ruling said the 9-line had no legal effect. The dredgers continued. The international community imposed no consequence. The Philippines accepted the ruling and then, under Duterte, largely accommodated China anyway. Under Marcos, it pushed back and paid a price in daily Coast Guard harassment and water cannon attacks on resupply missions. The question is not whether China will stop building. It has not stopped. It accelerated. The question is what the rules mean when one party simply decides they do not apply and builds, in the open ocean, the geography that makes its position unchallengeable without a military confrontation that no one has the appetite for. Every empire in history that built strategic infrastructure and contested space answered that question the same way, by continuing to build until the infrastructure became the new normal. Until the map changed. Until what had been disputed became, through sheer permanence, simply what was there. The sand is still being poured at Antelope Reef. The runway dimensions are forming. The world is still largely silent. The prosecution rests. If you have never had this explained not as a territorial dispute but as a manufactured geography strategy, the deliberate construction of a new coastline in a sea that already moves the world's trade, you won't find it assembled this precisely anywhere else. Stay close.